We are overjoyed to have you. Or if you have been away for a while and this is your first chance to start getting into the swing of things again, we've been studying the monsters of 2014 for the beginning of this year, considering the things that are holding us back. We've been showing this video every Sunday, talking about not only our desire to want to make it count, but also our call. That when God wipes the slate clean, and not just in the new year, but in the ways that we are forgiven, in the ways that we are redeemed, when God wipes that slate clean, we want to make it count. We want it to be something big so that we don't just continue to stay in the same place that we already were. One of the things that we know is that every year, I think this is true for me, that I look back at last year and I look forward to the new year, and however it turns out, I just want to make sure at the bottom line that this year was better than last year. That's my hope. Now, there are a lot of other things that I think we strive for, and I strive for in my life, but at the bottom line, right, we just want to make sure this year's better than last year, and sometimes that doesn't turn out to be the case, so we find that we need something more. But as we start out, we want to make it count, we are reminded again and again, we talk about these monsters, and we're having fun with it because it's funny the way life seems to kind of get us by surprise, but there's also kind of a serious component to this that talks about the evil in the world. The presence of Satan just wanting to sneak up behind us and trap us and hold us in last year, hold us in our past, hold us in our shame, hold us in regrets. Peter writes in his letters, in his first letter, chapter 5, he writes, "Your accuser, the devil, is on the prowl like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." That's kind of a scary thing to think about. But so many times we know that it is true, that the moment that we are relaxed or the moment that we feel that everything is past us and we're in this open place, the next thing we know, something comes out of nowhere and just wraps around us, terrifies our life, causes us to struggle in ways we don't understand. And we say, where is this coming from? Why is this happening at this moment? Things were going so well. And hence the monsters of 2014. I want to introduce you now to monster number 3, affectionately called the too much monster. This is the one that invites us to live into too much in the ways of excess, in the ways of just indulging in any way that we can, and often is remarked by being too much. Now, the secret weapon of this little fella, as harmless as he may look, is the vicious cycle. Maybe you're familiar with this. It's the circle or the cycle that you get into, and it has a start, but as soon it comes around, and suddenly there's no beginning and there's no end, and there's no way, perceivably no way out. So we're thinking about this vicious cycle, this vicious circle. I thought of a movie that has at least 1 ounce of truth. You're going to wonder what kind of movies I grew up with as soon as I tell you what movie this is. But if you remember back to 97, 99, and somewhere in the new millennia, a really popular movie came out. There were 3 installments of it, and it was about a spy named Austin Powers. You remember this? And you're like, oh gosh, where is he going? I told you to pray for me earlier. So in the second installment, I mean, this is a ridiculous movie, and I was going to show you a clip today, but my wife and I were viewing the clip over the week, and Sarah gasped, and she said, "You can't show that." After the second viewing, I agreed. But at the very end of this movie, so that's all about, it's this typical plot. They're fighting the evil people. Austin and his crime-fighting female partner are kind of caught by one of the evil adversaries. And in this kind of weird moment, I mean, it turns out being funny and ridiculous, just like the rest of the whole movie. But in the moment, this female crime fighter, she asks the villain, she says, "Are you happy?" And I can't even repeat the villain's name because it's offensive. And I'm not interested in saying those words here. But she asks him, "Are you happy?" And there's this moment that I love in the movie. I don't care about the rest of it, but there's this moment where this character, this evil character says, am I happy? He's got this Scottish accent. He says, of course I'm not happy. He says, I'm unhappy because I eat, and I eat because I'm unhappy. And there's this moment where there's just this truth of that vicious cycle that we get caught in, and there's perceivably no way out. That's the too much monster. That's the monster that gets us trapped, and we will do anything to get out of it, only to find that sometimes jumping out of one of those vicious cycles into another means that we just have two running instead of escaping the other. So I'm going to pick on Christmas one last time, because this is what this whole series is about, is kind of looking at what happens during this beautiful season that often gets corrupted. And last week I talked about how much I personally love the holidays and how much I just live into every aspect of it. It can be even a little bit ridiculous, and I love it. And then we talked about what happens January. But here's another side to this holiday, this Christmas season that we live into, because of the ways that our world, our society has kind of piped in other things into the birth of Jesus Christ. So it's an awesome time, right? We're looking forward to it. We're going to be with family. There's presence. There's reaching out to others. But think about also all the stresses that happen in that one single month. I mean, from a very superficial standpoint, we're looking at all the perfect gifts, or the big gifts, and the pressure that's behind finding these gifts or figuring out how to pay for them. There's the pressure from having a clean house. I mean, it seems petty, but those are real pressures. The end of the year pressure. Many of us, as the year winds down, it simply winds up for us, whether it's in our home life or whether it's in our work life, that there's a looming deadline, and it's called December 31st. And that can feel really heavy, especially when there are additional needs or additional requirements requesting your time, your energy. There's also the family drama, and I'm not making fun of this, but the drama that comes up in our families that seems to come up only in the month of December, that aches our hearts, that causes tension, that causes distance in the midst of our attempts to get together. There's stresses and pressure from money and finances, and are we going to make it through this season? There's the stress and the pressures from being sad, from missing people who have either left us or who have passed away. There's the stress and the pressure of loss and of past memories that we hold dear that are aching at us because we can't access them anymore. So there's all these things going on in our lives. And this celebration is awesome. But oftentimes, in the midst of how wonderful and beautiful it is, there's a lot of pressure. So how do we respond to all these things that are just looming above us and crashing upon us? How do we respond? We look around and eventually we say, it's too much. I need a way out of all this pressure. I need a way out of all this pain. I need a way out of feeling like I can't fix anything and I can't do anything about all the pain and stress and things that are going perceivably wrong in my life. So when we see that there's too much, what do we do? Now, I've been reading a book called Daring Greatly. It's Brené Brown. It's an insightful book that talks a lot about these things. And she says, and I totally agree, when there is too much coming in our faces and there's a lot of pain and a lot of pressure, what do? We numb ourselves. We numb ourselves. We eat, we drink, we go to parties, we listen to music, we watch movies, we go to places that make us happy, we eat, we shop, we spend money, we keep busy, we refuse to stop until we are absolutely exhausted and we pass out on the kitchen floor, we clean, we eat, we indulge, we do anything we can that will keep us away from the pain and the pressure that is looming in the midst of the season. We do anything to keep us from feeling the pain and the pressure of the season. See, Paul writes to the church of Ephesus, chapter 4. He writes, beginning in the halfway through 18, they are disconnected. And really, this is us. We are disconnected from God's life because of our ignorance and our closed hearts. We are people who lack all sense of right and wrong. We are who have turned ourselves over to doing whatever feels good and to practicing every sort of corruption along with greed. Again, these are hard words. They're convicting words. But we're all there to some degree. We've all been there. We know these words. We know what we're talking about here. They are disconnected from God's life, Paul says, because of their ignorance and their closed hearts. We become disconnected from God. God is so far away in the midst of our pain, in the midst of the things that we're looking at, in the midst of the too much that is looming ahead of us, that our hearts get really hard. And God is so far away. And instead of going to God, we turn ourselves over to doing whatever feels good. This is so familiar because it is true in our lives. That is one of the greatest reasons of why we indulge and get too much in our lives, is because we turn to things that we believe are going to make us feel good. And so the monster begins having its heyday, right? Your accuser is prowling, just waiting for you to get overwhelmed by all of these things so it can just reach out and give you a great big black dark bear hug. But that's not even the end, because we're not talking about Christmas anymore. We're talking about right now. So how does the monster keep working in our lives? Now, if this bothers you, don't look at it too long, because it's one of those impossible things, and it may drive some of you crazy, especially if you like to solve things and control things, and I'm not going to look at it. This is how the monster keeps working, though. You see, now it's the new year, and one of the things we celebrate is that Christmas, this, not the birth of Christ, not that celebration, but the holiday itself has finally passed. The chaos ends and the pressure begins to fade. So now we're here in this new year, and that's why we talk about resolutions. That's why there are 90% of the commercials that you will hear on public radio are about ways that you can change your physical appearance in some way or another, or buy a new car or something like that, because we're ready to start over and make it count, and the slate is clear. But that monster is just waiting, because it hasn't left us. We think that sometimes that we can just live into something and then walk away and be completely unaffected. But here's what happens in the new year. As everything looks really glorious and clean and bright and open for whatever comes our way, suddenly we see everything that we ignored while we made ourselves busy with all of our numbing things, whatever we did to make us feel better. We ignore a lot of things and we step into this other place. But, unless we continue with the numbing, we step back and then we find that all those things that we ignored, they're back. We're behind at work. Tax season is on its way. Sorry if I just made you panic. There are bills to pay. Credit card debtors love to delay the purchase showing up on your statement for about 15 or 16 days because you forgot about it. And yet, here it comes, either in the email or the mail. Here it comes, and that's exactly how we feel as those bills start to stack up. We have a house to clean. Spring sports are beginning, and we know that they're on their way, and we know they're going to own our lives. We're faced with the result of broken relationships over the Christmas season. And a lot of us are carrying a lot of shame for the ways that we lived into very unhealthy lifestyles for the last month. So we have all of these things piling up once again in the new year. And what happens? Monster number 3 comes back, and once again, as we try to clear the slate and let things be new, we look and suddenly it's too much. And suddenly it's too much once again. And what do when it's too much pain, too much pressure, too much stress, too much to be able to tackle? We numb ourselves. We escape from the pain in any way that we can. Our nation, our world, just again this week suffered another tragedy, another school shooting. We sit in the midst of this and we wonder, how are we going to approach these? When is this going to end? When are we going to find a way to respond to this? You see, it starts with the easy things that we numb ourselves with, with a vice or a specific thing that we just can't keep away from that makes us feel really good. But those things over time escalate. And when the pain comes to be too much in our lives, we will go to any extent to dispel or distribute some of that pain when it's too much. Now, I'm not saying I understand or can pinpoint why these sorts of traumas happen in our lives, but I know enough about what God is saying in His Word to understand that when we have too much, we will do anything, and that oftentimes means hurting other people when it's too much. When it's too much. I was listening to a pastor at a conference I had to go to for Methodist pastors in our conference this week. And in a very convicting way, she says, when these things happen, we want to blame everyone else. We want to blame the schools. We want to blame the parents. We want to blame their circles. We want to blame gun control, either the lack of it or the overbearing control of it. We want to blame everything. But she said, and I agree with this, who we forget to blame? We forget to blame the church. How are we dealing with our too much? And how are we reaching out to help other people discover a Jesus Christ that steps in the way of too much and says, you are enough, and I got you? See, Paul's teaching today, and I invite you to turn to Philippians chapter 4. As we've continued, just one chapter, this whole 3-sermon series sermons, this whole 3 weeks has been over 10 verses of chapter 4 because there is so much of God's word, God's truth packed in these lines. And Paul says in verse 8 today of chapter 4, "From now on, brothers and sisters, if anything is excellent and if anything is admirable, focus your thoughts on these things." If anything is admirable, if anything is excellent, focus your thoughts, and I would go to say your heart, your prayers on these things. All that is true, all that is holy, all that is just, all that is pure, all that is lovely, and all that is worthy of praise. Practice these things, Paul says. Whatever you learned, received, and heard, and saw in us, practice them. The God of peace will be with you, Paul says. And so in the midst of too much, in the midst of the circle that feels like we can't get out of because there's no start, there's no finish, and it's really hard to know just how to stop it. Is it the chicken that comes first or the egg? In the middle of that, Paul says, focus on these things. Focus on what is true, what is holy, what is just, pure, lovely, what is worthy of praise. Now, a lot of people listening today might even say, so essentially what you're saying, though, is instead of numbing ourselves with these really horrible things, we should just numb ourselves instead with these really positive things. But the power of God's word is not that this isn't simply a distraction or something that is tearing us away or simply allowing us to live in the happy world and pretend like everything's okay. No, instead, when we focus on these things, they become like lenses for us. They become filters for us. As a lens, when we focus on these things, then as we look out into the world, as we look at too much, as we look at the pressures and the pain that is looming in front of us, we don't see hopelessness anymore. As we focus on these things, we look through these lenses and we see one who is powerful of redeeming these things. We see one who is mighty enough to create all of us and everything that we know in this world. That's who we see. As we focus on these things, we have the opportunity to bring Jesus truly into our situation. Not that it's just a name that we say, but it is truly a living entity that enters into our lives and walks right in the middle of that circle and says, I know you don't know how to stop it. I know you're stuck, but I'll stop the circle. Get out. Focusing on these things allows us to do this, allows us to quit numbing ourselves and refocus what we see and what we know. Now, if you haven't been following along already, I invite you specifically to look at your outline on the back of your program today to see what I'm inviting you to take home, to continue to let grow in your hearts, to really look at this stuff and question yourself and wrestle with what it is in your life that Paul is saying. What is true in your life? What is truth? Paul says focus on that. For us, often we know that Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection, the reality of our sin, God's love is truth for us, that we are enough because God was willing in the form of his Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us. That is truth. Focus on what is holy. Focus on the things that are above the sickness of this world, that are uninfected by what we breathe into it out of our pain and out of our fear. Focus on what is holy. Focus on what is just. Focusing on what is good for the least in our world, for the lost, for the most abandoned, and for the most hated. Focus on those things, Paul says. All that is pure. All that is without manipulation in our lives, all that is without ulterior motives, all that is without personal gains. Focus on those things. All that is lovely, all that is pleasing, and without causing lust or this deep desire or this selfishness. Focus on what is lovely in your life. And finally, all that is worthy of praise. Focus on Jesus Christ. Focus on what God is doing in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the monsters, in the midst of the mountains that we feel like we can't even combat. Focus on those things, Paul says. And again, as we do, we find that we can look through a different lens, that the world we see doesn't look so gloomy. The world that we see doesn't look so intimidating or daunting or impossible, but suddenly we see that all things are possible through Jesus Christ, through the one who gives us strength, as Paul says, as we read last week. Finally, Peter writes in his first letter, chapter 3, 1 Peter, verse 3, he says, as we focus on these things that Paul has given us, as we focus on the one who gives us beauty, Peter says in verse 3 of chapter 3, don't try to make yourselves beautiful on the outside with stylish hair or by wearing gold jewelry or fine clothes. Instead, Peter says, make yourselves beautiful on the inside, in your hearts, with the enduring quality of a gentle, peaceful spirit. This type of beauty is very precious in God's eyes. Now, I think we know the intentions of what Peter is saying here. And when he says in there, instead, make yourselves beautiful on the inside, what we have to trust that Peter is saying is that this doesn't come from you. But when you focus on these things, you can let your heart be made beautiful by the one that is above you and who gives you these things. When we ask, when we submit, when we welcome them, when our hearts begin to soften, when we plead. And so this is what we have when the monster, the too much monster, comes walking our way. Focus on those things. Let those be mantras for your week, that as we see them, we see something that can be truly conquered in the arms and the grace of Jesus Christ. Let us pray.